Hey, everybody, good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. Welcome to Post Hoc Live. I am Drew Armstrong, executive editor of Endpoints News, and your host today. It is Thursday, August 7. Today, we're going to be talking about what we learned during second quarter earnings. We have a lot to get into: the Lilly versus Novo oral obesity showdown, how pharma CEOs are talking about Trump, about tariffs, about most favored nation, and a lot more, what Big Pharma is doing about their patent cliff, and plenty extra. We have a great set of guests today with our very own biotech correspondent, Kyle Husik, who just wrapped up Lilly earnings a few minutes ago, and I am delighted to welcome to the show BMO Capital Markets Head of Healthcare Research, Evan Siegerman. So thank you for joining us to those two. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to our viewers and our listeners. This is show number 14 for us. Every week we keep growing. Every episode we do has been reaching a few thousand people, and we're starting to hear feedback from some of you. And it has been awesome to see this expand and grow and turn into its own little thing. So thank you very much for watching and listening. Please keep your feedback coming. Tell us about great guests we should have on the show. Send us ideas, send us feedback. You can always find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I promise I read whatever you send over, and my DMs are open. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, hello. Post Hoc Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom. If you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, go down and hit that little subscribe button and the like button below our feed. You'll get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Hoc email on your Endpoints News subscription page. I'll remind everybody how to do that at the end of the show. So let's get started, get Evan and Kyle live with us, and dig into the second quarter. Evan, thank you for being with us. Kyle described you as like the hardest working man on Wall Street in biotech. I know it's been an insane and busy time. I think this is 50 plus quarters of earnings for me. I have my tropical shirt on because we're basically on the last day. I would like to be done with this. I'm super tired. I know Kyle is. I'm sure you have to be. Thank you for being here. I want to start off with, I think, what is probably the biggest news of the day and maybe even of the quarter, which is, this Lilly versus Novo showdown. Lilly came out with their oral obesity data today. Stock is way down. Obviously massive expectations leading into this. But can you walk me through the data, the announcement, the reaction we're seeing, and how people, like you and the folks who are on the buy side are thinking about this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I am exhausted. I got my coffee right here, if you can see it, because it's been a long earnings cycle, and every day seems to be just new news that's surprising, and these moves have been wild. So let's talk about orforglipron. Everyone was highly anticipating the orforglipron obesity data, and I think kind of the headline number was that they didn't meet their expectations that they set. They had framed this as being an oral alternative to Wegovy, or kind of, semaglutide, getting to about 15% weight loss. And we didn't hit that. We had 11 and change. And I think that when these companies set an expectation and they don't hit it, people are disappointed. What's also interesting, at the same time as the Lilly call, Novo was hosting a call in London with their new CEO, talking about the potential for high-dose oral sema, so basically oral Wegovy, which has pretty good efficacy numbers, about 16 or so percent. So in this race for an oral drug, who's winning? I think kind of Novo was the dark horse and is now pulling ahead.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this because it feels like these very big stocks have been extremely volatile around this data. And we have lived in a world where what has defined these markets hasn't necessarily been do you have 2 percentage points higher of efficacy? It's been supply, it's been your arrangements with payers and things like that. Do you think some of this stuff is potentially an overreaction in that context? I guess when I'm thinking about how are the orals going to be used, is 11% good enough? I mean, is there going to be that much differentiation when we start to see this stuff? How are you thinking about this long term in the context of, obviously against the expectation setting that they maybe whiffed on a little bit?
For sure. Well, I think, definitely the move is probably an overreaction. Lilly had a great quarter. They beat Mounjaro and Zepbound numbers, raised guidance. That's exactly what you want. And absent the orforglipron data, the stock should have been up. I think there's just so much hyper focus on the 1% here, 1% there. 11% weight loss for many patients is fantastic, and that's all they need in the convenience of a pill. But when, it's this like really close horse race, everyone's just trying to anchor on to what's better. I think the other issue that has come up is you looked at kind of the high rate of discontinuations. I think it's like 24% or so, and that's high. And I don't know if they had a really good, explanation as to why that happened, other than maybe folks weren't getting the weight loss that they wanted. And that's critical when it comes to the durability and the long-term kind of trajectory of this market, because a lot of patients start on these products, but in order to get to that $100+ billion market that we all have in our models, you need to have patients stay on therapy for the long term. And I think that could be driving some of this. Also, just, expectations. This is priced to perfection. And when you don't hit, things come crashing down.
Speaking of those expectations, Evan, you're on the earnings call today. I'm wondering what your thoughts were on Dave's comment that Wall Street's focused on the exact numbers and that doesn't necessarily carry over to the real world. Do you agree with that
I
view?
agree with that, but that's like commentary from 2 years ago when we were just starting to learn about this market. Lilly came out and set expectations. I had Lilly at my obesity summit in New York back in March, and I'm going to read a quote basically talking about their expectations. In the obesity study, we have individuals with type 2 diabetes. We saw roughly something like 14% or so, again, referring to, I believe, Wegovy. We haven't reached a plateau. We'll probably be a little better, but somewhere in the range where semaglutide is. So they can say all they want when it comes to, a percent here, a percent there, but we're going off of the expectations that they set.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think, when we think about the orals, how do you think that when we get to this being a commercial competition, like what do you think is going to define wins and losses there? I mean, are we going to see the same type of manufacturing capacity bottlenecks? I obviously, like, I can't imagine that Novo is going to make the same mistake again on manufacturing, and obviously different parameters here with an oral. What have they said, and what are your thoughts about how this is going to play out when we get to that stage?
Well, a few considerations. One, I want to talk about the real world profile of these products because, orforglipron doesn't have what's called a food effect. You can take it with or without food. And, that's really convenient. The problem with, oral sema is that you have to fast, take it with a little bit of water, then wait 30 minutes before you can eat again. And while that's probably fine kind of in the context of a clinical trial or just like, a cerebral thought exercise on using this, if you're a parent and you're waking up every day and you forget to do it and you eat something and you mess up your dosing, or you got your kids running around and you can't get your coffee because you got to wait that 30 minutes, you're going to get sick of that over time. And I wonder how that plays out. So that's the first thing. The
You
second
sound like
thing,
you have little kids like I do.
I have a 7-month-old at home, and our mornings.
That was spoken like a man who is living this moment.
And I also have like a very needy golden retriever that needs to be fed at 6:30 in the morning. So it's chaos. The other thing is access, right? It's like the big issue with a lot of these products is, insurance coverage. And I know the insurance coverage has approved on the commercial side, but what's going to happen? Or, how do these companies play the contracting game? Does Novo lean in and just add this to their CVS exclusive? Is Lilly able to muster kind of, some sort of coverage there? I think Dave's, there was commentary on the call about how they expect, volume headwinds because of the CVS deal, Lilly regarding, the CVS exclusive deal. And I think that's going to be really important because the way you get to these big numbers is a lot of folks need to get on therapy. So that's going to be really important. But I wonder how that profile actually, impacts real world usage.
Yeah. Can we turn to the Novo situation? I mean,
Sure.
they obviously, they've made their executive changes,
Oh, yes.
and it hasn't been particularly well received, I don't think. And, they have, I think, really been dinged by the market for having, like blown one of like the great leads in all of like one of the great, pharma products
Right.
here. What was your take on the executive changes? We've got a new CEO, we've got some other folks in play here. How do you think this plays out, and what's been their kind of initial outreach to the market in the weeks since then?
Well, a few things. One, I think they had their eye off of the prize, right? I don't think that they necessarily a few years ago believed that obesity was this massive market, right? They were a diabetes company. And even when kind of, semaglutide at a higher dose was used for obesity, it just never seemed to be something that they wanted to lean into. So they never made the investment to
Yeah.
satisfy this market. I also, believe that management did not really believe that compounding was going to be an issue. And now that's been a huge issue for them. And it feels like they are now finally, using the force of legal action to stop that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like a ready, fire, aim situation
Mhm.
where they thought that they could just, ride the coattails of this market and not be strategic. In
Yeah.
terms of the CEO transition, I always frame that, CEO transition might feel good, but it takes time to fix a situation, right? I go back to an example when Gilead was kind of, not doing so well and they got rid of their CEO in 2018. It
Yeah.
took Dan O'Day 7 years to really turn that story around. So it doesn't necessarily fix everything. I think Mike has a lot of work to do. He needs to be more aggressive. He needs to be more strategic. There had been hope that there was, their U.S. head was going to be the CEO, but at the end of the day, it's really going to take that strategy 180, and it's still TBD. And I think my note was basically saying they have a lot of work to do, and that is still the truth today.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha.
How
Um,
quickly, how quickly do you want them to move? I know you just mentioned the Gilead situation took years, but I imagine.
Well, we don't have years because 7 years from now, semaglutide is going to be off patent. There's going to be other products there, and they're going to fall by the wayside. They need to make real strategic action now. And I think their first real opportunity is not just with CagriSema, but also with oral semaglutide. This is going to be the first, really oral product for obesity, and they need to lean hard into that. One other kind of interesting thing is I want them to accelerate their CagriSema co-formulation. They had a successful phase 1 trial that got overshadowed in the earnings release yesterday, but they have to run a phase 3 trial. And, I'm not going to get into the nuances of regulatory kind of guidance and whatnot, but it would be great if they could figure out how to get that to the market faster.
we'll talk some FDA stuff in a minute. I do want to back out a little bit. I mean, and hear from you
Sure.
what type of other themes you're picking up. I think something that I have noticed is that like we have been through this period over the last few quarters of pharma cost cutting, getting rid of headcount, implementing cost cutting programs, and BMS, Pfizer, now Merck, and some others as well. And I think Bayer, obviously, it feels like maybe we're kind of hitting the bottom of that and seeing some people report a little bit of EPS growth and things like where are we on this kind of pre-giant patent cliff cost structure realignment cycle that seems to go through this industry, at least at the big companies, every like essentially some like giant animal migration every few years.
Right. Well, listen, I think pharma is always a tough sector because these companies have to reinvent themselves every 10 or so years, unless you're AbbVie, you get 18 years. But it's what we're, these CFOs are really cutting because they need to maintain those margins, right? That's what Dave Denton is doing, and he's doing a great job of it. Pfizer, for what it's worth, despite all of their recent challenges, had a great quarter. Nice top line beat, really good expense management, and I think folks are very pleased with their results. What was it, Tuesday now? I don't even know what day it is at this point, but it's pretty clear that you know that there's mounting pressure from insurers, governments, whatnot, to pay for these drugs, and that you really have to win by driving innovation. And I think that takes time. You look at someone like Merck. You got ahead of GLP-1s, there's going to be a massive cliff. You probably got the biggest patent cliff in history with Keytruda. It's not all going to go to zero, but you're going to maintain some share, but the pricing is going to go down. So Merck needs to be very thoughtful about how they spend now, because they need to make sure they're reinvesting in the pipeline, make sure they have free cash flows to do acquisitions, and they're not in that upswing. So we are seeing that. I think generally this quarter, the mood in pharma has been tough, and the whole policy side of things hasn't helped. Pharma tariffs, MFN, it's just this like buzzwords that keep persisting. And it really makes it hard for these companies to chart a strategy to figure out how to grow into the back half of the decade. And it's all about growth into 28, 29, and 30. And I think that, these companies are cutting. They're trying to figure out where to reinvest, but with that level of unknown, it can be very hard. And if you look at kind of the winners and losers in the broader market, healthcare has just lagged. And I think that, it's going to take more than just better obesity sales to get us out of that kind of, doldrums.
Have you been surprised that we haven't seen more M&A than we have? And I ask that both kind of within the context of, this world of bolt-ons that it seems like we live in, and like single product deals, but also like I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this long enough that I remember that when we had these kind of, macro level, or not macro, but like, kind of very broad company level kind of pressures, that you would see bigger transactions and combinations and people looking for those synergies. And like, that doesn't even seem like it's even on the horizon right now.
Let's look at three big deals in recent memory: Bristol Celgene, Amgen Horizon, Pfizer Seagen. You can also add Allergan AbbVie. Have any of those transactions fundamentally solved these big existential problems that these companies had? I would say probably not. Bristol Celgene gave Bristol a lot of cash flows for Revlimid, but Bristol's no better off today than they were before they did the deal. You have, Horizon has been a bit of a disappointment for Amgen. That kind of gets glossed over. No one talks about that.
Yeah. And
then even Seagen, I think, Padcev is great. They're getting some things, but it's not like it fundamentally changed the Pfizer story.
Yeah, and the stock's still trading at like $24 or something like that. I don't know what it is today, but like, yeah, it's not 40.
Right. So these big transactions, they're great for M&A bankers who get a fee, but I just wonder, is that how you build a better company? And I think that the Merck Verona type deal, very interesting. I think it's that sweet spot, because you want assets that are de-risked, that can contribute to growth, but taking on a huge, enterprise integration, it doesn't necessarily solve all of the strategic issues that these companies are running into.
Do you think some of the pharmas will just continue doing the China in-licensing deals that we've seen, like right after the Verona deal? GSK did that deal for the exact same target.
I think China is going to be an increasingly more important part of kind of the biotech ecosystem. There's a lot of interesting innovation there, and you can get stuff for pretty good deals. But even with that said, the diligence is hard. And then you also have to bring over the assets to kind of the West to do your clinical trials, because kind of Western regulators aren't really going to accept large scale trials from China. So it's a great place to go asset hunting, but you're not going to find a super de-risked, phase 3 ready or approval ready asset from a Chinese only company.
What's your take about how we've been hearing pharma talk about China? Because I feel like I hear like two things coming out of some of the companies. One, all the deal making that's happening with these licensing deals and these transactions, and then two, almost a total opposite, which is this really deep concern, and typically in response to something that the Trump administration has done, which is we're falling behind China. We need to be competitive with China. Look at everything China's doing, and if we don't change our regulatory approach, or if you put, MFN pricing on us, then we're going to fall behind China. I mean, it's, they seem to run what China has and then be very concerned about, protecting what the US has in some ways.
I think for a Chinese biotech or pharma company to be successful, they need to be able to sell their product in the United States and Europe. Right? There is a big pharma market in China, but it's not at the same level of value as you do get in the United States. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. It is the dream of any Chinese pharma company to have a partner like a Merck, Bristol, Pfizer, GSK or the likes, right? That's how they unlock the market. And so it's going to be this push and pull. I agree that there's probably a lot of like innovation happening, but we'll see if that actually produces differentiated assets. You can go to China and you can find an oral GLP-1 with a danuglipron scaffold that probably doesn't have IP, pick one up pretty quickly. But what do you do with that? You still got to run the obesity trials. And even if you get lucky, things still don't go right. I mean, Lilly is the leader in obesity, and they still didn't have, a stellar readout. So you can make all that investment. I think in terms of competitiveness, we do want to make sure that, we are not letting, China get ahead. There are probably things that we can do better, but at the end of the day, I would say, it's going to have to be a partnership, because in order to get those assets out of China, you need that U.S. partner or that European partner. Otherwise, it goes nowhere.
Yeah. What are the surprises that you've heard out of this quarter that you think, have been kind of the biggest stories coming out of earnings, or thematic stuff that you're picking up on right now that you think is going to carry us into next quarter? And we're going to be talking about then.
Well, I still think, tariffs, MFN, that kind of persists. And, the Dear Pharma CEO letters have been pretty interesting. And the fact that I think there 3 CEOs have been called out by name: Len
Yeah.
Schleifer, Dave
And
Ricks,
obviously, Dear
and,
Len-
and Albert
I mean,
Bourla.
I laughed at that because it was like, dear Albert, screw you.
Yeah,
Like,
I know.
it's
And
so
that's
nice
like,
and personal. And then like,
I know. Well, I guess the question that we need to really figure out is, what does the administration actually want here? Because, and my concern is, I don't know if the administration knows what they want. They
Yeah.
want headline, they want to bash on kind of big bad pharma, but what do they actually want? Because we can't achieve anything without an end goal in mind, similar to with the tariffs. Like, throwing out ridiculous tariff numbers without any sort of end goal in mind, it is not productive, right? You can use trade policy productively, and I don't know if this current kind of chaos is being productive.
Yeah.
If you want to, raise prices for drugs in Europe and lower them here, then fine, then say it. But let's come up with a framework that actually makes sense and figure out why drug prices are high here. It's the PBMs, right? It's these high list prices. It's a whole complex ecosystem that you have to kind of dismantle. And I don't know if that Dear Albert, Dave, Len letter accomplishes that.
Yeah. Well, and Kyle,
Yeah.
you were listening. I mean, you mentioned you were we were talking about this on the Lilly call that I know you were
Yeah.
listening to, and Rick seemed like he really leaned into exactly what Evan is talking about here.
Yeah, he is basically saying Europe needs to pay their fair share, which is exactly what Len said as well. Len called it the Dear Len letter and said that
Yes.
Trump knows him by name because their drug saved his life during COVID. But yeah, I mean, Riggs was saying today that he agrees, on the D2C model, and he agrees that Europe needs to pay their fair share, but it's how you go about doing it. And it seems like an open-ended question on what, like you said, we don't know exactly what the administration wants, nor do they.
Well, I think,
yeah.
what I think is also interesting is, how do we as a society, I mean, it's going to philosophical here. How do we as a society value medicines and what they bring? Because it seems that, outside of the United States, the inherent value of medicines is less. And that's okay. And that's fine, but we need to just be honest about what that is. And I also think that and we don't have to get into the complexities of health insurance, but the system that we have is a bit of a mess, because people look at drug pricing as what they pay at the insurance, at the pharmacy counter. And that's so divorced from list prices and what these companies receive. And we don't have to get into PBM reform, but I think that there are a lot of nuances in the system that drive up cost, and that could be used and altered to really bring down what ultimately is out-of-pocket cost and accessibility for patients. When I think of DTC, that's great, but if you're an employee on an employer health plan and you're bypassing your insurance policy to get a DTC kind of product, well, then that's like, then you're paying for something you're not using. So why don't you fix what you're paying for and figure out how to, make that more accessible via insurance?
Yeah, I think I've long been pretty skeptical of this DTC idea. Like, the idea that you're going to get a 60% discount on a $30,000 product is not going to make that available on a consumer. Like, the market for that is zero without some other significant add-ons that either get your insurer to reimburse for it somehow, or something like that. And then it probably ends up looking a lot like a negotiated price at the end of the day. I mean, I'm vastly oversimplifying here, but I think, you talk about, like, are we trying to get a headline here, or are we trying to actually get meaningful healthcare reform? And that feels like more like healthcare headline than healthcare reform to me.
I would agree. And I think headlines are driving a lot of the narrative right now, which is great if you're a news organization or writing catchy note titles.
Yeah.
Or catchy note titles, but if you want to actually affect health policy, it's not really getting you far.
Yeah. Just backing up to this conversation about, how the industry is talking about the Trump administration. I think I'd be curious to get your take on this. I feel like when we were back in January, we were at JP Morgan and we had the Trump administration incoming, and in the first quarter, like, there was a lot of reluctance and conservatism from pharma CEOs and people to really say much of anything. I mean, it was very much like wait and see, don't stick your head up. Now it feels like, I mean, in their way, we are starting to see some more meaningful pushback. And it feels kind of very typical pharma, but it feels like pharma talking to a Democratic administration talking points, not pharma talking to a Republican administration, but they're being a little more outspoken. We're starting to see things on FDA. We're starting to see, commentary around this pricing stuff. Do you think the tone is changing in relation to how people are talking about Washington? And I'm wondering how much you see that filtering down to kind of the small
Right.
biotechs as well, where we're seeing pretty direct criticism of the
Oh
FDA
yeah.
in some
I
point, which
mean,
is like a rule that like you don't say a
right.
bad word about the FDA if you're a little biotech that lives or dies by what the regulator's going to do.
Well, I don't envy any pharma CEO's position because I can sense that there's mounting frustration with the policy environment, but they have to kind of keep it together and, not be overly critical. They have to kind of use, kind words and rational thinking, which can be hard to do in this environment. But I would agree that there is definitely mounting frustration. And I think that frustration really stems from the fact that the administration has these goals, but they don't fully understand the nuances of our very complex healthcare system. So there's that one component. I also think that, you have, for example, kind of the whole vaccine skepticism with RFK, and it just seems to just be, I don't want to say anti-science, but it seems to be almost kind of counter to, how we approach public health. Like, why was there a wholesale cancellation of all those 500 mRNA vaccine projects? It's not $500 million in the context
Yeah.
of a federal budget isn't a lot of money. And if we found one or two uses outside of COVID for one of those, that could be, have massive savings. Don't wholesale cancel based on bad information, right? His reasoning probably wasn't accurate, which is very frustrating. In terms of the FDA, massive amounts of frustration. I cover this little company, Replimune, and they really they had a tough go at it. And what's probably really frustrating for them is that they had written confirmation from the regulators in their mid-cycle reviews that they were on track not only for potential approval, but that their confirmatory trials for their melanoma drug were good. And then at the 11th hour, they get this rejection without much context. And it's really hard to be a small biotech and operate in an environment where all of a sudden someone comes in and changes stuff. Yeah, we don't know the nuances of their conversation, and there could have been more clear signals that there were issues, but I get the sense that those issues need to be brought up well in advance when you're designing a confirmatory trial, not when the drug is up for approval.
Yeah.
Well, to the point about the FDA, obviously there's the whole Vinay Prasad
Oh my
news
God.
right before earnings season started. I think
Yes.
there would have been a little bit more commentary or at least some peripheral conversations about that, but it didn't seem like there was any during earnings season.
Well, I think in big pharma, they're not going to talk about kind of like the CBER administrator. Like they kind of want to just, they don't want to rock the boat there. But I think also, there was so much just seemed like political, pushing behind the whole Vinay Prasad ousting. The Laura Loomer and her whole push to get him out wild to me. So I think some of these pharma CEOs probably just don't want to wade there, and they just want an FDA that's functioning. I think Commissioner Macri is probably a little more level-headed, but to your point, they don't want to shake the boat. But I think if you're a small biotech like Replimune, what do you have to lose when you've already kind of lost a lot?
Yeah. Well, Evan, take us out here. I mean, what are
Okay.
you going to be looking at in Q3? What are your big questions? What are you going to be watching most closely? When we have you back 3 months
I
from now,
know.
what are we going
I
to be talking
know.
about?
What are we talking about? Well, I hope we have some resolution to some of these health policy issues. I don't think we will. I think that they're still going to persist. I think also, we need to have more clear answers to how these biopharma companies reinvent themselves into the back half of the decade. Is it more M&A? Is it, I just want a more clear strategy to help us get confidence into those later, numbers in the 2029, 2030 timeframe. And of course, we'll still be talking about obesity. Maybe Novo will have turned a corner and start to be more of the favorite in the obesity arms race, but we'll see. I think the EASD meeting in September will be supremely important. And it will be very interesting to see a quarter end what the new CEO at Novo Nordisk does to turn their fortunes around.
Yeah, I would love for us to follow up on that in 3 months, and I think it's going to be we're going to be watching right with you. So
I'll be here.
yeah, fantastic. Evan Siegerman, BMO Capital Markets, thank you so much for being with us. Kyle Husik, our biotech correspondent, thank you as well. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. We are going to be following all of this closely. You can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news and by subscribing to our newsletters. The recording of this conversation is going to be on YouTube, and the audio will be up in a few hours on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, if you are already signed up for the Post Hoc newsletter, you'll get notifications the next time we have a broadcast coming up. We run about once a week. If you're not signed up, I would go over to endpoints.news, and then in the top right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link. Then hit preferences and then click to activate Post Hoc. You'll get our newsletter then. You can also follow us on X, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Spotify and Apple Podcast, and Blue Sky by searching Endpoints News. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. This is Post Hoc Live. I'm Drew Armstrong, and we will see you the next time news breaks.
Thanks, guys.